Welcome to the Economist in Your Ear podcast. When the world's two largest economies tighten their grip on essential global commodities, things like advanced semiconductors, rare earth magnets, are they actually building economic guardrails? Or are they just sort of drifting toward mutually assured disruption?
Yeah, that really is the central question right now, isn't it? It kind of defines the whole U.S.-China relationship these days. We're seeing this pretty dramatic escalation in export controls from both sides, from Beijing and Washington. So today we want to try and move past the sort of alarmist headlines, and really unpack this idea of reciprocal vulnerability.
Reciprocal vulnerability.
Yeah.
Sounds dangerous.
It is. It's the situation where each side can really hurt the other. But we also want to maybe challenge the idea that this has to lead to constant brinkmanship, constant conflict.
Right, because the situation feels really unstable. And I think part of that is the asymmetry, isn't it? The U.S. seems to be going after these very narrow strategic things, advanced chips, AI software, the sort of high-tech brain power.
Exactly. Surgical strikes, almost.
Yeah. While China seems to be targeting much wider stuff, like basic industrial inputs, battery materials, rare earths, the physical nuts and bolts of everything.
Precisely. So you've got two completely different types of choke points being held by these two huge economies.
Which means each side can disrupt the other in a really unique way.
That's the reciprocal vulnerability right there.
So, okay, what specifically kicked off this latest, this most recent flare-up?
Well, it seems to stem from two specific regulatory moves happening quite close together. First, you had China. On October 9th, their Ministry of Commerce, MOF, announced these expanded controls.
Covering what exactly?
Covering a whole range of things, actually. Rare earth materials, yes, but also the technology and equipment to produce them, permanent magnets, and crucially, some specific battery-related items.
Okay, and these aren't kicking in immediately. I saw something about a delay.
That's right. Many of these measures aren't set to take effect until November 8th, 2025, so yeah, there's a long lead time for industry.
But the signal?
The signal is unmistakable. Meanwhile, you got Washington being just as assertive. They're using regulations and rhetoric.
Yeah, we've definitely seen the U.S. tightening its own rules. The Bureau of Industry and Security, BIS, right? They handle the export controls.
They do, and they recently updated their 50% rule for re-exports, which basically it broadens the scope of foreign-made goods with U.S. tech that fall under Washington's control. It pulls more things into their net, so to speak.
And then there's the rhetoric. President Trump's been, sending mixed signals.
Very mixed. You get these social media posts saying, don't worry about China, it'll all be fine. But then, almost in the same breath, threats of massive tariffs, maybe even 100% tariffs if talks don't go well.
It's a very public high-stakes negotiation tactic.
Definitely playing for leverage.
But despite all that noise, the diplomatic door isn't completely shut. There's talk of a meeting.
Yeah, that's the interesting part. We're expecting Trump and Xi to meet probably around that Asia gathering in South Korea later this month.
Which suggests both sides know how damaging it would be if things totally broke down.
You'd hope so. But even the timing of these recent moves is causing friction before they even meet. Washington wasn't happy that Beijing announced these new controls just weeks before the planned summit.
And China's response?
Well, Chinese officials, naturally, are pointing back, saying, hang on, the U.S. tightened its own rules multiple times recently, hitting lots of our companies.
It's the classic who started it problem in international relations.
Exactly. Everyone thinks the other side made the first aggressive move.
And it's not just export controls, is it? China's also showing it can apply pressure inside China, like that antitrust review of Qualcomm's deal.
Right, the Qualcomm Autotalks deal review, that's another way they can signal displeasure or exert influence over foreign companies operating there. It's another lever they can pull.
Okay, let's zoom in a bit more on these new Chinese controls, because that seems to be where a lot of the current market anxiety is coming from. People talk about rare earths, but what's the specific detail that's really worrying global companies?
I think the single biggest thing is this extraterritorial reach clause. So the rules require licenses for exporting certain materials and tech. That's standard enough.
Right.
But, and this is the key part, the rules say that foreign-made goods, if they contain even trace Chinese content, might also need an export license from China.
Wow. Extraterritoriality. That sounds like a massive expansion of their regulatory power. Can you, give an example?
Sure. Think about, say, a German company making sophisticated machine tools. Inside that tool, there's a critical rare earth magnet.
Okay.
Now, if that magnet originally came from China, even if the final machine is assembled entirely in Germany, and then they want to ship it to, I don't know, Brazil.
Yeah.
Under these rules, that German company might have to apply to MOFCOM, to China's Ministry of Commerce, for an export license just to ship their German-made machine from Germany to Brazil.
Because of that one tiny magnet inside.
Potentially, yes. If it falls under the trace content definition, that's what creates this huge uncertainty across supply chains that snake all over the globe.
Right. Now, MOFCOM has tried to calm things down, haven't they? Saying it's just routine refinement and will have limited impact.
They have. They frame it as aligning with national security goals, standard procedure, but that's not really how the market interprets it.
Why not?
Because in practice, regulatory bodies tend to be cautious, especially when national security is invoked. Bureaucrats often err on the side of being overly strict to ensure they're complying.
So even if the official line is limited impact, the reality could be delays, maybe selective denials.
Exactly. That risk of bureaucratic friction, of things getting slowed down or unexpectedly blocked, that uncertainty itself becomes a significant cost for businesses, regardless of the official intent.
And all this is happening against a kind of confusing economic backdrop. We have the U.S. Treasury Secretary, Scott Bessent, saying China's economy is in a downturn.
Right. He's been quite public about that, and even suggesting the U.S. might need to take equity stakes in companies or build up government stockpiles to make U.S. supply chains more resilient.
But is China's economy actually struggling that much? The trade data seem to tell a different story.
Well, that's the counterpoint, isn't it? China's overall exports were actually up quite strongly, around 8% year over year in September.
So where's that growth coming from, if not the U.S.?
It suggests that while maybe domestic growth is slower, China is successfully shifting its trade focus, expanding exports to non-U.S. markets. Think Southeast Asia, the Global South. They're managing to offset slowdowns elsewhere.
The global trade map is actively being redrawn.
In real time, yeah.
Yeah.
It blunts some of the intended U.S. economic pressure.
Okay, so this brings us to the core question, maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Given all this tension, these new rules, the rhetoric, is this phrase mutually assured disruption maybe a bit much? Does it overstate the immediate danger?
I think it's worth questioning, definitely. It paints a picture of constant crisis, like we're always on the brink of disaster. The reality might be, well, a bit more mundane, perhaps even ultimately more stable, paradoxically.
How so? If we challenge that mad narrative, what are the assumptions we need to question?
Okay, let's break it down. Assumption one is probably the idea of symmetry of pain. The idea that if I hit you, you can hit me back just as hard.
Right. Why challenge that?
Because as we talked about earlier, the pain points are fundamentally different. They're asymmetric. U.S. controls hit those very specific, high-value things, advanced chips, that China really struggles to make itself right now. They're hard to replace quickly.
Whereas China's controls,
while potentially very broad, cover these wider industrial inputs. Things like battery materials or certain rare earths. Now, they're critical, absolutely. But often, over time, you can find substitutes or develop alternative sources, even if it's slow and expensive.
So the leverage is real on both sides, but a complete shutdown would hurt differently.
Vastly differently. The economic consequences wouldn't be balanced. That's why the equilibrium feels unstable. The choke points aren't equal in their immediate impact or replaceability.
Okay, asymmetry of pain. What's assumption number two?
Assumption two is probably the biggest source of fear, the idea that licensing equals embargo.
Meaning people hear about that trace content rule and just assume everything with a Chinese component is now blocked.
Exactly. And that's usually a mistake when looking at export controls. Jurisdictions, including the U.S. with its own export administration regulations, often write these rules very broadly on purpose.
To give themselves maximum legal flexibility.
Precisely. They want the option to control almost anything. But in practice, they typically end up approving most license applications, maybe with conditions attached. The real devil isn't always the rule on paper, it's how it's enforced.
So, if the rule itself isn't the thing to panic about immediately, what should we be watching closely?
The key metric to watch is the licensing throughput.
Throughput, like how many licenses get processed?
Exactly. Think of it like the speed of the bureaucratic conveyor belt. How many applications are actually getting approved, and how quickly? If that throughput stays relatively high, even if companies face way more paperwork and costs,
then the actual disruption to trade flows might be limited.
It could be manageable. The disruption becomes serious if approvals suddenly slow to a crawl, or if the criteria for approval become completely unpredictable. Firms right now seem to be bracing for complexity and delays after November 2025, not necessarily a complete systemic shutdown. And that difference is huge.
That makes sense. Which leads us to assumption 3, that the intent is purely punishment. Are both sides just out to inflict maximum economic damage on each other?
Well, it's probably not just punishment, though that's certainly part of the signaling.
Yeah.
Both Washington and Beijing are framing these moves, at least partly, as necessary legal and regulatory upgrades.
Modernizing their systems.
Yeah, aligning their trade rules with stated national security objectives. They're basically institutionalizing these export control regimes, making them a more permanent feature of their economic toolkit. Many advanced economies do this.
So if the rules, the criteria for getting a license, are actually communicated clearly,
Then this institutionalization could, counterintuitively, lead to more predictability down the road. Businesses might not like the extra hoops, but they can plan around them if the rules are clear. Just seeing it as pure punishment misses that longer-term effort to formalize government oversight.
okay, this is where it gets really interesting then, the market reaction. If companies truly believed immediate, mutually assured disruption was coming, you'd expect panic,
Okay.
right? Commodity markets going crazy.
You would, but instead what we seem to be seeing is adaptation. Maybe faster than the headlines suggest.
What does that adaptation look like? Are companies hoarding rare earths?
They're acting rationally given the uncertainty. We see evidence of resilience like that strong September export data for China. Companies are definitely building up buffer inventories of critical materials. They're actively looking for dual sourcing options, finding a second supplier just in case.
And redesigning products.
And even redesigning products, yeah. Trying to engineer out the specific components that might fall under these new rules, qualifying alternative inputs. It's this kind of proactive adjustment that's dampening those worst-case scenarios.
So if the problem is tighter rules and bureaucracy, maybe the solution isn't some grand political bargain, but more about procedural fixes.
I think that's exactly right. This is where diplomacy, like that potential Trump-Xi meeting, is still critical. Not necessarily for solving all the big disagreements, but for achieving some procedural stability.
What would that look like? Minor agreements.
Even minor clarity would help enormously. Things like agreeing on faster timelines for processing licenses, providing clearer official guidance, especially on that vague trace content rule, maybe agreeing on specific carve-outs for things like essential civilian goods or medical supplies.
So making the system workable, even if it's more complex.
Exactly. If they can achieve that, this unstable equilibrium we're in could shift towards something more like workable guardrails. Trade gets slower, definitely more bureaucratic, much more expensive in terms of compliance, but it becomes safer, more predictable for businesses to navigate.
So stepping back, what's the long-term picture emerging here? If we're moving beyond mutually assured disruption, what are we moving towards?
I think the pattern looks less like a permanent crisis and more like perhaps structured interdependence.
Structured interdependence,
Meaning trade obviously continues, these economies are deeply linked, but it's going to be characterized by much tighter rules, a huge increase in the need for licenses, and significantly higher compliance costs for companies everywhere.
but not a complete halt.
No. Critically, there's still room within that structure for predictable case-by-case approvals, provided, and this is the big caveat, provided the day-to-day politics don't constantly override the established regulatory processes. Trade becomes highly scrutinized, expensive, bureaucratic, but it doesn't necessarily stop.
Which leaves us with a final thought, maybe. If both sides end up just making trade slower, costlier, more bureaucratic, does that actually stabilize things by creating clearer, albeit frustrating, boundaries? Or does all that bureaucratic friction itself eventually build up and trigger the very confrontation they claim they're trying to avoid? Thanks for listening. Follow us for daily insights into world affairs. And don't forget to like, comment, and share.